Good evening and welcome to the first plenary talk of this conference. Memory, Security, Sustainability. I hope you had a coffee and samosas and you're sufficiently awake because we are in for a treat, trust you me. It's an absolute honor and pleasure to introduce the speaker for this plenary who happens to be a stalwart really in the field of memories. He's also a very dear friend, someone who has worked with us, collaborated with us for a number of years, and someone who just trusted us even before we were a center, didn't do anything, just sent an email, an email, and she responded, and we just took it from there. With the pandemic, and we spent a good 2 years in the pandemic doing a series of really interesting virtual workshops, and then one thing led to another organically. We signed an MOU with the University of St. Andrews, where Catherine is obviously the Dean and Professor in the School of Modern Languages. She also happens to be the Dean of Arts and Divinity. And we're very excited to announce that we're about to start a mobility program with the University of St. Andrews, which will sort of involve faculty and student exchange, which will hopefully lead to course supervision and, fingers crossed, joint PhD in the not too distant future. But it's an absolute pleasure to introduce Catherine formally. Like I said, she's one of the stellar scholars in the field of memory studies. She's published and researched extensively on Keta, particularly in relation to politics, fascism, censorship, authoritarianism, and how Keta and different art forms, allied art forms, correspond, resist, as well as represent complex political systems. So I think we have this sort of title up there today, and I think this is exactly germane, perfectly germane to what we're trying to achieve thematically as well as philosophically in this conference, looking at the triangulation, as it were, between memory, security, and sustainability. It says climate fiction, future memory, eco-mourning, and migration control. So as you can see, it's profoundly political as well as very theoretical and very complex. And obviously, this also connects to some of the basic tenets we do in memory studies, so some of the fundamental tenets, looking at anticipation, not just as an epistemic device, but also a cultural cognitive condition. So without any further ado, I'll leave you in the very, very able hands of Professor Catherine O'Leary, but please join me in applauding her as she begins her plenary. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Abhishek and Myron, for inviting me here and for hosting me so graciously. I'm really enjoying my time here, and I've had some wonderful conversations with various people in the room, and I hope to have many more. So it's an absolute pleasure to be here. So please stop me, chat, and tell me what you're doing. I'm genuinely interested. I had some fantastic conversations with the PhD students from here also, and some of the master's students, and I'm really blown away by the level and the range of work that's going on here. So it's a really exciting times for memory studies in India, and I think it's wonderful to see this conference as well, which is really thriving. So an absolute pleasure to be here. So yes, this is my title. I've tweaked my work slightly, so it's still approximately right, but bear with me as I am talking about climate fiction, future memory, eco-mourning and migration control to a lesser extent, but they're there. So today I'll be exploring the links between memory studies and climate fiction in the so-called age of the Anthropocene. I'll look at questions of climate anxiety, climate justice, as well as the so-called environmental turn in memory studies, before concentrating on the importance of storytelling for shaping understanding of a problem that often seems so vast as to be incomprehensible. So climate change, as we know, is real, and the role of human behaviour in the crisis that we face is difficult to overstate. NASA tells us, for example, that there is unequivocal evidence that Earth is warming at an unprecedented rate. Human activity is the principal cause. Humans, therefore, need to be at the centre of our response to the problem of overconsumption of fossil fuels and the resulting global warming and species destruction. While we are officially in the geological age, the Holocene, the term Anthropocene, the age of humans, coined by Nobel Prize-winning atmospheric geochemist Paul J. Crutzen and biologist Eugene Sturmer in the year 2000, has taken root. While the formal definition was eventually rejected by scientists of the International Union of Geological Sciences this year, the term remains in common usage, and I suspect we will continue to use it in literary studies and memory studies for some time to come. The profound impact of past and present human activity on the planet, particularly since industrialization and increasingly from the mid-20th century, the so-called Great Acceleration, leading to species extinction, global warming and pollution, has already changed land, air and water. In addition, it draws a significant question mark over human and non-human futures. The humanities, I suggest, have a significant but underestimated role to play in communicating the crisis and in the development of creative solutions with others. Yet the scale of the problem has become a problem in itself. It is difficult for people to understand how individual actions can have impact on a global crisis whose tipping point seems to be in an undefined future. Moreover, the apparent temporal distance, and in the first world often, but not exclusively, not entirely geographical distance, from the negative impact of climate crisis makes a postponement of corrective action seem reasonable or at least acceptable to some. Not only are the problems vast and on a scale that is difficult to comprehend, but solutions are also slow. So how can the public's attention be grabbed? How can the crisis and potential solutions be rendered meaningful to ordinary people living everyday lives? In his influential book, Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor, Rob Nixon asks, how do we bring home and bring emotionally to life threats that take time to wreak their havoc, threats that never materialize in one spectacular, explosive cinematic scene? He defines climate crisis as a sort of slow violence, a violence that occurs gradually and out of sight, a violence of delayed destruction that is dispersed across time and space, and attritional violence that is typically not viewed as violence at all. In addition to the vast scale and relatively slow pace of the problem is the issue of technology and its impact on our attention spans. Used to instant feeds, immediate answers, and constant demands on our attention, our technological age in the Western world at least does not lend itself to the slow time necessary to process big, complex issues. Historian Deepesh Chakrabarty challenges us to consider humans as geological as well as biological agents because of the impact of our actions on the planet. It is clear, however, that our responses thus far don't scale up in parallel. Policy specialists, he tells us, think in terms of years, decades, at most centuries, and politicians in democracies think in terms of their electoral cycles. So how do we grasp the problem when the solutions are short-term? One of the consequences of the scale of the problem and its global reach is an emerging sense of helplessness and anxiety, especially amongst the young. In a large international study carried out in 2021 and published in Lancet Planetary Health, a group of psychologists led by Caroline Hickman and Elizabeth Marks found that distress about climate change is associated with young people perceiving that they have no future, that humanity is doomed, and that governments are failing to respond adequately, and with feelings of betrayal and abandonment by governments and adults. These findings were based on a survey of 10,000 children and young people in 10 countries: Australia, Brazil, Finland, France, India, Nigeria, Philippines, Portugal, the UK, and the US. We should not be surprised that climate anxiety largely afflicts young people. In a 2021 UNICEF report, the climate crisis is a child rights crisis. It stated that approximately 1 billion children nearly half of the world's 2.2 billion children live in one of the 33 countries classified as extremely high risk. As Henrietta Fore, UNICEF Executive Director, argued, the climate crisis is a child's rights crisis, given children's exposure to the environmental shocks exacerbated by lack or inadequacy of basic services, water, sanitation, healthcare and education. So those most impacted are the young and the poor. And this brings us on to the matter of climate inequality and climate justice. An issue that brings together questions of ethics, politics and law, including security. The impact of exploitation and use of resources by rich countries is felt disproportionately by poorer countries and communities. Chakrabarty again summarises the problem. Human-induced climate change gives rise to large and diverse issues of justice. Justice between generations, between small island nations and the polluting countries, both past and prospective, between developed industrialised nations, historically responsible for most emissions, and the newly industrialising ones. Those most at risk from climate shocks and environmental degradation, it seems, are also those with least power to address them. There is a history to this. Colonisation and capitalism have played a huge role on how the planet is viewed by rich countries. In The Nutmeg's Curse, Parables for a Planet in Crisis, Amitav Ghosh traces the history of nutmeg from its origins in the Banda Islands to discuss the impact and legacy of colonialism and capitalism on our understanding of the world around us. Terraforming, earth shaping, a term first used by science fiction writer Jack Williamson, while often presented in climate fiction as the exploration of new planets for habitation or exploitation, is in fact nothing new, but rather an extension of the history of colonialism. Indeed, such planetary ambition is no longer even fictional. If we consider the aspirations of figures such as Elon Musk, who hopes to create a sustainable colony on Mars with his SpaceX making humanity multi-planetary is the slogan. So where do questions of security come in? Well, in policing resources, forced removals of populations and borders closed to climate refugees. The problems caused by developed countries are also often policed by them. If we turn, sorry about my slides. If we turn to Nixon again, he tells us, confronted with the militarization of both commerce and development, impoverished communities are often assailed by coercion and bribery that test their cohesive resilience. How much control will, say, a poor hardwood forest community have over the mix of subsistence and market strategies it deploys in attempts at adaptive survival? How will that community negotiate competing definitions of its own poverty and long-term wealth when guns, bulldozers, and moneymen arrive? Such communities typically have to patch together threadbare, improvised alliances against vastly superior military, corporate, and media forces. While I won't explore today the work of scholars such as Netta C. Crawford on military consumption of fossil fuels and the securitization of the response to climate change are key to understanding the interconnectedness of security and sustainability. In sum, as we've seen, climate change is driven to a large extent by human activity, yet the scale of the problem is difficult for the human mind to grasp in a meaningful way. In addition, climate anxiety linked to a sense of foreshortened future has emerged as a growing mental health issue amongst young people. And it's clear the climate crisis highlights questions of equity and injustice. Any solution to the crisis necessarily involves a multidisciplinary approach, with science, technology, politics, law, international relations, ethics, and communication all playing a part. And this is where memory studies and climate fiction come in. as tools for shaping the understanding necessary for action to take place. There are interesting connections to be made between climate fiction and memory studies. From a humanities point of view, climate anxiety, learning from the past, and anticipating future trauma can be usefully read through the ideas from the interdisciplinary field of memory studies, looking at what and how we remember, the impact of traumatic loss, mourning, bearing witness, and nostalgia. As cultural theorist Claire Colbert reminds us, to remember is never simply to retain and recall a past, but always to do so from the point of view of a present that anticipates a future. Climate fiction plays with time, memory, and place, and often portrays a future trauma or memories of an imagined dystopian future society. Affect, so important within memory studies, plays a key role in how we imagine human reactions to climate shocks. The fictional past that is remembered and mourned in climate fiction is often the reader's present or immediate future. The fictional present is a future dystopia. The message is often that a different future can be chosen now from the tipping point of the reader's present. These fictions indicate what losses we will lament in the future if we don't alter our behaviour and act differently from now. Several memory studies scholars, including Steph Krapps and Astrid Earle, have recently proposed an environmental turn in memory studies. In an essay on ecological mourning, living with loss in the Anthropocene, Krapps explores, and I quote, how literature and art more generally serves as a cultural laboratory for articulating and dealing with grief related to environmental loss, which remains largely unspoken and unrecognised. The link between climate anxiety and eco-mourning is an interesting one. Mourning, as we know from memory studies and we learned from Freud, can function as a kind of working through, allowing us to live with loss while not being overwhelmed by it, and hopefully to be inspired to action in the present. The danger with climate anxiety, of course, is that it may lead instead to melancholia, trapping us in a repetitive negative mode, overwhelmed by the enormity of the problem. Climate fiction is also a form of bearing witness, testimonial writing for future trauma, although it's not future in some parts of the world. While it faces the unreliability problem of all testimonial writing, it does what fiction does best. It allows for the exploration of intellectual and emotional responses to various imagined scenarios. Steph Krapps makes a further important point about memory and climate and what happens if we forget what a normal, healthy planet looks like, environmental generational amnesia. He argues that we need to ensure that memories of past environmental conditions are kept alive in the social fabric, while remaining vigilant not to succumb to a politically dubious and debilitating nostalgia. Here too, climate fiction, like the broader discipline of environmental humanities, can play a role in reminding us of past knowledge and environmental cultural memory. So then, what is climate fiction and what can it do? The humanities and climate fiction can help us to understand this tension between the global or planetary and the individual, and to bring things down to a comprehensive scale. For example, Barbara Kingsolver's Flight Behaviour from 2012 captures very well the tension between a global crisis, signposted by the waylaid monarch butterflies, and the portrayal of the immediate and local concerns of the community, such as debt, unemployment, child raising. It also captures the tension between religion and science when seeking explanations for the unusual or mysterious. Climate fiction's importance is linked to storytelling, how it can help to shape how we understand and communicate the crisis. As Nixon asks, how can we turn the long emergencies of slow violence into stories dramatic enough to rouse public sentiment and warrant political intervention? These emergencies whose repercussions have given rise to some of the most critical challenges of our time. Climate fiction can also relate to the climate justice movement in that it can give voice to those silenced in other fora, be they affected or displaced by climate change, or even non-human voices. The question for us is, to what extent does cli-fi do this? What voices do we hear in climate fiction? Whose are excluded? And how can we, in universities, facilitate such work? How do we capture the non-human or minority voices? In this paper, my focus is on the human aspect, but the non-human is very much part of the climate fiction and eco-memory discussion. Colonization and language are intertwined in both reality and climate fiction. We know that environmental knowledge is lost when the colonizer's language is imposed, and climate fiction is a space in which this can be explored. When new linguistic norms relate to the colonizer's homeland rather than the newly conquered landscape, a loss of understanding takes place. And Irish dramatist Brian Freed explored this idea in his play Translations, in which local knowledge about land, which was embodied in Irish language place names, was lost in a process of Anglicisation. As one of the characters says, something is being eroded. For Adam Trexler, fictionalizing climate change is not about falsifying it or making it imaginary, but rather using narrative to heighten its reality. Climate fiction, in short, allows us to consider the value held in past knowledge of land and seas, to imagine possible futures, including future technology, to explore effective responses to planetary change, and to work through responses to traumatic events. It therefore addresses the problems identified by Nixon and Chakrabarty of slow violence and scale. While some climate fiction is sensationalist and thrilling, some is more slow-paced, thoughtful, and considers marginalised voices. Yet all of it, even the most melodramatic, creates narratives that scale the problem down to human level. Or, like Richard Paver's Pulitzer Prize-winning novel The Ogre Story, asks us to think about our place relative to other species. As Rick Cranshaw has noted, in climate fiction, as in reality, man is both perpetrator and victim. Linking this to Michael Rothberg's idea of the implicated subject, we might ask if climate fiction can help us to move on from a complicit or inactive bystander stance to one of positive action for environmental health. Climate fiction draws on science fiction, obviously, or indeed can be seen as a branch of science fiction, although it is increasingly part of the mainstream fiction. There's been a shift, however, from the celebration of a technology-enhanced future in much of earlier science fiction to a warning note being sounded about a polluted, degraded, anxiety-ridden and species-unfriendly dystopian future in much climate fiction. Sometimes representing a post-apocalypse landscape, hope, where it exists, is often found in a rather problematic return to the pastoral, a paradise lost, or sometimes in technological solutions to our current or imminent problems. Another feature of climate fiction, flood narratives, resonate with even earlier cultural stories and myths, imagining when rising sea levels, which already threaten islands and coastlines in many parts of the world, reach famous urban centres, such as London or New York. Climate fiction also echoes the planetary term in climate science, environmental history and memory studies. As Trexler observes, climate fiction has increasingly allowed non-human things to shape narrative. In fact, we might say that much climate fiction owes a debt of gratitude to James Lovelock's Gaia, a scientific hypothesis named by his neighbour, the novelist William Goldman, and its acknowledgement of the Earth as a living organism. From here, climate fiction can help us to face up to and think through some ethical issues. What is our responsibility to the non-human around us? How do we think about human accountability in an increasingly secular society? The argument can be made that climate fiction oversimplifies or exaggerates and thus misrepresents climate science and technology. Yet fiction is not supposed to simply represent fact. It allows for exploration of scenarios and speculative futures, while pondering how we and others might react to them on an emotional level. A technology-infused or controlled modernity is one trope of climate fiction, sometimes positive, although more often negative, where human-machine boundaries are broken down and technology is part of a dystopian surveillance state, constantly monitoring the activities and thoughts of its citizens and identifying those who do not comply with its authoritarian rules. An example of this is from one of the texts I'll talk about a little more in a minute, Rita Indiana's Tentacle. And this is on the first page of the novel, and it shows this breaking down of human tech boundaries in a very negative way in this case. Bringing her thumb and index finger together, Athilde positions her eye and activates the security camera that faces the street, where she sees one of the many Haitians who've crossed the border, fleeing from the quarantine declared on the other half of the island. Recognizing the virus in the black man, the security mechanism in the tower releases a lethal gas and simultaneously informs the neighbours, who will now avoid the building's entrance until the automatic collectors patrolling the streets and avenues pick up the body and disintegrate it. So, a horror version of the future in this particular text. Yet even where the science is futuristic or simplistic, rather than evidence-based, it points to the centrality of science to discussions about climate change. Climate fiction and the environmental humanities generally are not instead of science, but rather complementary to it. Often linked to science and technology in climate fiction are authority figures, generally capitalists or defenders of capitalism. And while Chakrabarty has pointed to the oversimplification involved in this, it's still a useful trope that links greed and overconsumption to climate change and suggests that a more equitable system would be better for people and environment. As scholars such as Trexler, Bosch and Crawford, from their different perspectives, remind us, the military, another powerful authority, has a very important stake in fossil fuel consumption, policing of resource exploitation, and indeed in climate movement. And much early research into climate change and its impact on the mobilisation of people, boats and planes was carried out by the military. Climate anxiety, too, has long been a feature of climate fiction, and Anne Kaplan, a film scholar in her study of futurist dystopian worlds in film and literature in the post-9/11 era, puts forth the notion of pre-traumatic stress syndrome and suggests that representations of pasts that have been lost or future traumatic events function as warnings, a kind of memory for the future. As in reality, anxiety can coexist with hope in climate fiction, and this hope is often linked to activism amongst the young or future generations, but also to slowing down and engaging more deeply with nature. So, to show how climate fiction explores the themes of memory, sustainability and security, I'd like to briefly consider two examples of climate fiction. One, a short novel, Tentacle, written by Dominican writer and musician Rita Indiana in 2015, translated from the original Spanish by Achille Becas, and the other, a graphic novel for children called Global, by children's authors Owen Colfer and Andrew Donkin and illustrator Giovanni Rigano, which was published in 2023. The first, Tentacle. As we time travel in the novel from the not too distant 2027 to 2037, back to the 1990s and early 2000s, and even to the colonial 1600s, with Tentacle's shape and gender-shifting protagonist, Athilde Figueroa, we're invited to question human behaviour in the face of seemingly irreversible degradation of our planet. The novel considers the impact of the colonial past on present and future, and uses memories of the past from different future perspectives to challenge the reader's complacency. The novel is set in the Caribbean, in the Dominican Republic, which shares the island of Hispaniola with Haiti and is framed by various time periods: recent political history, the arrival on the island of the Spanish, and a speculative near future of polluted oceans, economic and climate migration, and a hostile surveillance state. The novel tells the transformational story of Athilde and is a Bildungsroman of sorts as she progresses from the miserable life of a sex worker to that of a maid in the house of Esther Escudero, to prison, and also to a life of wealth and privilege. Esther, the elderly woman, is spiritual advisor to the president of the Dominican Republic, who's also her brother. But she is also Omipule, servant of the ocean goddess Yemaya of Yoruba tradition. The Yoruba mythology and language that appears throughout the novel also tells us a story of the colonial slave trade and movement of people between West Africa and the Caribbean. Omipule serves as a guide to Athilde, who is revealed to be the mythical chosen one with a foretold mission to save the ocean. To do so, however, she must become Olukum, the Lord of the Seas, and travel through time to act in time to save the ocean. The main story of Athilde is set in 2027. In that time, via an illegal trans drug called Rainbow Bright, Athilde becomes male and also becomes Olukum. And this is done when a sea anemone is placed on mysterious marks that have appeared on her, now his, head. The sea anemone is the symbol at the heart of the novel. Like the spices of old, its rarity conveys great monetary value upon it, but it has been removed from its now degraded natural habitat and exists simply as a treasure to be possessed. It is significant that the figure of Olukom, which is a real figure in the Yoruba tradition, controls not only water but also health and wealth, although in the novel these elements are in opposition to each other rather than in harmony. Athilde's time-travelling metamorphosis to Olukum takes place at an underwater portal full of sea anemones in the year 1991 at a beach called Playa O. Athilde Olukum begins to live there in the 1990s, but Athilde continues to exist in 2027, on the run and eventually imprisoned for her part in the murder of Esther. While in prison, Esther's brother, who is the president, visits and shows her a hologram. It's a bit sort of Star Wars Princess Leia. There's a hologram in which Esther says to Athilde, "Use the powers you have begun to discover for the good of humanity. Save the sea." But Athilde chooses not to reveal the extent of his new powers, nor to save the sea. Instead, he chooses to interfere with the past to give himself wealth and status at the beach where the portal exists. He becomes Giorgio Menicucci, a businessman and philanthropist in the 1990s, while coexisting as Athilde in 2027. So in his 1990s life, Giorgio is helped to get rich by his future self. He's ostensibly a self-made man, but he sets his sights on a woman called Linda, who's a rich girl who dreams of saving coral reefs, but her dreams are funded by her rich daddy. The author mocks the pomposity of such wealthy, dilettante environmentalists. In the name of environmentalism and social responsibility, the couple in fact clear all the natural fauna near the beach to build an eco-village, a contemporary version of terraforming that echoes the clearances carried out by the Spanish in the same location in 1606. And the couple also exploits the young artists that they claim to support in their worthy-sounding cultural project. The author, Rita Indiana, also comments on the political use of language. When Linda tries to convince her rich father, who is a Jewish refugee from World War II, of the importance of her work saving marine life from extermination, he replies, "Extermination is a strong word. You shouldn't use it when talking about animals," thus revealing one of the other problems faced by climate activists. The unwillingness of many, and in some cases for understandable historical reasons, but nonetheless, their unwillingness to see beyond the human in terms of the impact of the crisis and to see the interconnectedness of the various species on Earth. So Linda's environmental work also contrasts with the destruction of the seas by overfishing, but she doesn't understand the local fishermen's need to survive. She wants to own what she saves. Her beach is private. In the novel, only the poor understand that water is nobody's property. In the novel, the story of Athilde Giorgio in the 90s intersects in the year 2000, when he reaches it, with that of another character, Argenis Luna, a talented artist who's jealous of what other people have. The portrait of this selfish man is a fairly brutal takedown of modern consumer culture and both its emptiness and performative radicalism. Luna becomes one of the artists in Giorgio and Linda's cultural project, but a near-death experience of the mystical portal gives him flashbacks to a previous life during the Spanish invasion and colonization of Hispaniola, which mirror to some extent the activities of Giorgio and Linda, the philanthropists, in the present. When eventually the moment of the Yoruba prophecy arrives and Giorgio meets the young Said Bono in the 1990s, he knows it's the moment to give him the message that will prevent his later environmentally destructive actions when he's president. But I feel that Giorgio thinks instead of himself and what he might lose. The novel ends on a chilling note, a damning indictment of human greed and apathy. After chatting about rap and politics, he said goodbye to Said without a word about his future. He could sacrifice everything except this life, Giorgio Minakuchi's life, his wife's company, the gallery, the lab. None of the characters in the novel is pure. Politicians are corrupt, radicals are sold out, religious leaders are exploitative, artists are superficial, environmentalists are shallow and self-regarding. Everyone is selfish and greedy. Even the female Athilde we meet initially is no innocent young victim, either of capitalism or of powerful mysticism, but instead she's a picaresque character whose self-awareness is made clear, as is her understanding and embracing of the unpleasant side of human nature. Everyone is on a make. The planet will pay the price. Tentacle connects the hopes of the spiritual with the political and the technological in the face of a human-engineered crisis, but shows with dark humour how futile this hope is. The opportunity to halt the crisis is sacrificed on the altar of greed and immediate gratification. The depressing conclusion is that avarice, not altruism, is the driver of human behavior. So I'll turn very briefly to Global, a graphic novel for children. This shows how communities are not all affected equally. Juxtaposing here, the Bay of Bengal, and there, northern Canada inside the Arctic Circle, this graphic novel focuses on the impact of climate change on two children. 12-year-old Sami from here, and 14-year-old Yuki from there. Sami and his grandfather fish to eke out a living. Yuki goes to school but is anxious about climate change and is on a mission to save the bears who are threatened by it. Her mother deals in real estate, facilitating the large-scale movement of people from the community to the city. What this story aimed at young readers shows us is that children represent hope. They want to take action. They're open to new ways of thinking, and they have not yet learned the prejudices of others. They're at ease both with the stories of the past and with modern-day technology, but they're also impetuous and take risks. Sami, in his desire to help his grandfather earn enough from fishing to live well, sets out alone to retrieve the fishing knife his parents used, which was lost when they were killed in a storm. He nearly dies in the process, in yet another storm, and we're told that storms are getting worse and are happening more often. But he's helped in his survival by an item he finds in the sea, an old harpoon, turned into an umbrella of sorts that helps him to make his way back to safety, although his grandfather's boat is destroyed. This is a children's story, however, and it offers a positive ending. So Sammy is able to sell the knife to a wealthy family and use his skills as an artist to teach art and gradually pay back the loan that the wealthy family gave him to buy a good new boat, which allows himself and his grandfather to have a better living. He also manages to trade some fish for access to a computer to send a message to a contact detail that was written on the harpoon, which is a more recent addition to the traditional markings that are also on the harpoon. In the parallel story, Yuki sets out with her dog Lucky to prove the existence of growlers, a mixture between brown and polar bears. But they are destined not to survive because they don't have the skills of either. And they have become climate refugees, seeking food where humans live and causing fear amongst the human population. Yuki sets up a photography shelter, like an umbrella, made from her ancestors' seal harpoon. She's attacked by a bear, gets lost, is hindered by an avalanche and other climate change-induced factors, but eventually makes it home. She, at some point, loses the harpoon in the water, and we know that Sammy picks it up later. In her odyssey, she comes across a frozen lake with trapped methane beneath, and knows from her reading that the great danger if the ice melts and the methane is released. But she finally finds her way home and meets a rescue party that is out to locate her. And as they are coming towards her, the bear nearly catches up with her, and she frightens it away with a flash of her phone camera. The rangers who are looking for her take aim at the bear with guns. The final chapter, 1 year on from the end of her adventure, shows Yuki's photograph of the bear, which she took as it was looming above her, not only has won a prize, but has changed local practice, and rangers now scare bears away with lights and noise rather than shooting them. At the end, Yuki receives a direct message request on her phone from Sammy, from the other story, and the novel thus ends on a cliffhanger. We can expect a follow-up, a second novel, I imagine, in which the protagonists will meet. But the graphic novel's depiction of displacement resonates with Nixon's idea of the loss of lands and resources beneath them, a loss that leaves communities stranded in a place stripped of the very characteristics that made it inhabitable in the first place. Here, the fishing community is constantly under threat, not only from pirates and storms, but also from the erosion of the land on which they construct their houses. Land that is so salt-laden that it is unproductive. The shrinking land must be shared with more and more people as they are displaced from drowning fishing villages or evicted from their farmlands. In the other story, Yuki's neighbours choose to move to the cities in the name of progress, with little awareness of what they're losing in the process. The story stresses the importance of remembering old knowledge in order to be able to read the landscape and understand the environment, but also as the landscape changes in order to be able to adapt. Certain symbolic items function as repositories of environmental memory, the seal harpoon and the fishing knife, which are contrasted in the story with the failure of modern technology. For example, the lack of a phone signal means that Yuki can't get home easily. But technology and modernity are not completely rejected in this novel, and the email address, for example, that's etched onto the harpoon facilitates communication and future interaction between the protagonists. And the phone camera is also presented as a tool for documentation and witnessing. In the end, the story stresses the importance of solidarity and collaboration to long-term survival. The book gives us a vision of one world united by water rather than many lands divided by it. The harpoon that travels in water and brings salvation to Sammy unites him symbolically with Yuki. The coda to the graphic novel is a representation in graphic and accessible form of the science behind fiction, and it therefore proposes that climate fiction is again a complement to and a way in to climate science. It also suggests to a youthful readership a joined up way of thinking about our planet and our actions. So, we're here in a university. What can we do? So, what is the role of a university, and the humanities in particular, in addressing climate change? Do we as educators have a role and an opportunity to make interventions? For Stephanie Lemanager, who's an environmental humanities scholar at the University of Oregon, one of the great gifts of the humanities has always been to remind people that we do get to participate in our futures. Futures are collaborative and never near. One way of thinking about this is in terms of Donna Haraway's idea of staying with the trouble. This is what universities are good at. Allowing people the time and the space to explore big ideas, and crucially, to do so within an inter or multidisciplinary environment. We are in the privileged position of being paid to think and to explore big ideas. We're sometimes given funding to explore scenarios and solutions based not only on evidence, but on blue sky thinking. We also have the responsibility of influencing future influencers. We can encourage our students to think about climate, sustainability, habitability, and the future. And we should listen to them too. Climate change is, as we know, a political and legal, as well as a scientific and humanities problem. Can universities help to equip our students to talk to policymakers and the media and the various communities affected by climate change? In addition to the scientific and technological work taking place, humanities colleagues in my own university in Scotland consider what we can learn from the past, how we can address the ethics of energy production or energy finance, and how we can craft useful narratives to encourage action. We talk to each other across our disciplines, as we must. And one of my colleagues, Althea Davis from the School of Geography and Sustainable Development, suggests that there's a need to use both a quantitative approach with ecological analysis and a narrative approach, looking at community involvement, scenario planning, and past learning. In fact, at lunch yesterday, the day before here, I had a conversation with a visiting scholar, an American engineer, Javier González Rocha, who uses robotics to measure methane emissions, but who, in addition to his engineering work, told me that he's also collaborating with social scientists and humanities scholars to think about how can they communicate what they do to the communities they're working with. And some of what they do is theatre as a form of storytelling with the local communities. So I am optimistic. I think we must be. Interactions with colleagues at my own university, in other networks, events such as this conference show that universities are crucial for inter and multidisciplinary thinking and have a key role to play in harnessing our shared understanding of so many fields of study that can help us to shape a sustainable and more secure future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. And what a fabulous and fitting way to end the first day of IC&SR 2024. This was a very enriching and scholarly talk. It also aligns very well with our conference themes very perfectly. Memory studies, ecological crisis, human lives and systems in pursuit of secure as well as sustainable solutions, and all of this explored through the framework of fiction, through multiple memory narratives. This was truly interdisciplinary while staying firmly rooted in literary memory studies. And we do believe that the thrust of the talk is also on the power of memory and storytelling. It's foregrounding a world in which one can no longer separate the real from the imaginary. And what was really beautiful in Stella, I do think that in the way it ended, on a very pragmatic and optimistic note, reminding us of what our role is, and also telling us how to do this thinking, how to process, what and where to engage with, identifying those many entry points through which we need to stand in the gap and take action, take charge of thought processes, and more importantly, how to stay with the trouble. Thank you for this really beautiful reminder. And the relevance of such a theme and the importance of having an interdisciplinary dialogue and a confluence to understand these many contemporary challenges, it was already evident in the scale of the number of abstracts that we received for this conference, which was 650 plus. It was very encouraging and very humbling for us to know that this is something, this is a very unique kind of a combination which really deserves more attention, or even, deserving multiple subsequent workshops and multiple other engagements, not only from IIT Madras, but also from various partnering institutions where you have come from. And we could accommodate just about 350 abstracts in both virtual and offline mode. And we thank you all for being here. And we really hope that this conversation which has started today is just the beginning of the many more interesting conferences, projects, the individual interactions, joint collaborative ventures, all to follow in the next many months, and the systems that we will continue to build over the next many years. Thank you all, and thank you, Catherine, for this really wonderful opening keynote on day one. And thank you all participants for being such a wonderful audience, and we really love the interaction and the energy in all three rooms. It's very rare to find conference events where people are all the time talking about what they are working on, trying to find other collaborators and trying to share dialogues. And this is just the beginning of this. We're excited to have such a wonderful group with us, and some of you have visiting us the second and third time. And we do hope that this first day itself is an encouragement for you to already think of coming back for the INS 2025. So with this note, we end the day one. Thank you very much.